Hi, welcome to Excel 3. Today we're going to be talking about some more advanced techniques with a lot of the basic things that we've learned in previous classes. So we're going to examine more advanced editing tricks that you can do, how to make changes to formatting that we haven't discussed before. We'll learn about protection and tracking to increase the security of your worksheets. We're going to talk about some advanced formulas and functions that are available, taking some next steps beyond the basic functions that we've used so far. We'll get into some of the options available with charts that you can create and how you can make them more illustrative of the data that we're going to put in. And finally, we'll discuss some of the options available in Excel and how we can customize it for ourselves. Before we begin, I want to show you how to get to the resources that we're going to use in class today. So if you look at the screen, you can see the library's website. This is mybpl.org. And when you come here, you'll see a number of resources available to you from home or wherever you are. But for today, we wanted to go into services and computers. Here you see some different options for things that we have in the computer department, and we're going to focus on computer classes. And then right near the top of this page, you see classes and materials, and you can see the Excel 3 handout and exercise. So if you'd like to play along and you want to work in the exercises I'm working on it on the screen, you can use that. If you want to have the outline of today's class that I'll be reading off of and working through, that's available as well. Simply click on either one of these and they'll pop right up. So there you can see the Excel 3 handout. It's a PDF file, so you should be able to read that on just about any computer. The other file is Excel, so if you don't have Excel on your computer, you will be unable to open it unless you have a similar spreadsheet program that allows you to work with those things. Most of what we talk about in class today would be applicable to other programs, but just to be clear, we are using Excel 2016. So that's what we're going to be working on today. I'm going to go over to the exercise, which I've already downloaded, open that up and get ready to start. We're going to begin with the editing section. So let's begin with advanced editing. First, I want to talk about freezing panes. This is something that is not too terribly difficult to do, but can be very helpful in a lot of situations, so I like to make sure that everybody knows that it's there. What you're doing when you're freezing panes is you are locking in a certain section of the screen so that it is always visible. You typically do this with categories at the top or key rows on the left-hand side, key columns on the left-hand side that you would want to make sure you could always see. For our example that I have here, I made a Rolodex, and if we wanted to keep track of what the categories were, as we started to add more and more names, as you scroll down, you would lose the categories at the top. You would just see the data, and it might be confusing which is the area code and which is the ID number. What we can do with this is we can lock in that top row and freeze it. Now, to do this, we want to go to the View tab in the ruler. See right up there. About 2/3 of the way from the left to the right, we see Freeze Panes. When I click on that, you see some options. If you have an older version of Excel, you might not have all three of these. You might just have Freeze Panes. I'll explain that in just a second. They put in some simpler options here that a lot of people will use later on. Either freeze the top row, that would be row number 1 going across there, or freeze first column. That, of course, would be column A going up and down there. More than 9 times out of 10, freeze top row is going to be what you're going to want. That'll work just fine for most situations. Because when you do that, you can now see when I scroll down, the categories across the top remain visible. So you can always see what you're looking at on these bars. If, however, you have, say, letterhead at the top or some extra information or some situation where you need more than one row frozen, or if you also needed a column frozen, this might not do what you need. In that case, I'm going to go back to Freeze Panes and choose Unfreeze Panes to take it back to normal. So when I've done that, it now goes back to scrolling normally here. Then I will put my cursor, the little box that we move around here, which you can move either by left-clicking or by using the arrow keys on the keyboard. You put that below the row that you want to have frozen and to the right of the column. In this situation, I just want the top row to be frozen as it was, but if for whatever reason I wanted this column of their first names to always be visible, I could move the cursor over one column there. So it would be at B2. Now when I go to Freeze Panes and I simply choose Freeze Panes, you can see it not only locks in the top row, but if I keep going to the right, you can always see the first name. Again, this isn't something that's terribly useful in Most spreadsheets, I typically only lock the top row in, but there are some situations where it can be nice to have one or two columns on the side that are locked in as well. For example, if you have a very large Rolodex with a lot of information, one that would be helpful to show you would be, if it wasn't a violation of privacy, would be the library card database. We have more than 10,000 people's names, and they have lots and lots of categories of information going across. And I can tell you firsthand, you can sometimes get lost in the information as you are reading across the row. So it can be helpful to have that first column or two locked into place so you can always find their name. So in those situations, it can be useful to lock in the columns and not just the top rows. But most of the time, the top row is what we care about the most. So I can go back to unfreeze panes and simply freeze the top row, and that will do that for me. So again, that was a lot of details about it. We talked it through quite a bit. The basics are pretty straightforward. If you want to lock in the top row so it's always visible, go to View, Freeze Panes, Freeze Top Row. Okay. Now I want to talk about selecting non-contiguous ranges. That's a complicated name for a relatively simple thing. If you've been in my Excel 1 class, or you've taken that online or learned about it anywhere else, you might have learned about how to highlight data that you want to make changes to. So if you want to change a cell, you would simply click on the cell that you want to change. If you wanted to change a row, you click on the number of that row. If you want to change a column, you click on the letter of that column. You can click the entire worksheet by clicking the square to the left of the A and above the number 1. And you can drag across an area if you wanted to change a group of cells, like so. But what do you do if you want to change, say, the phone number and the ID number and the first name, but not the ones in between? You wanted to have sort of a striped look so it's easier to tell one line or one column from the other, or if you just had a couple of cells that needed to be changed, maybe Harold and Ben here both needed to be updated. If I click on one, if I left click that is, and then I left click on the other, it loses the highlighting from the first one. But if you hold down the control key, that's the one that says CTRL in the bottom left hand corner of your keyboard, it allows you to highlight more than one row or column. This is what we call selecting non-contiguous ranges. So you're selecting ranges of cells that aren't connected to each other. So you can grab, by holding down the control key, all over the place and grab whichever particular cells you want. Obviously, this is just kind of a messy cluster of them, but if you wanted to do something that made a little bit more sense, you could highlight column A, column C, column E, and then when you made a formatting change, like for example, I change in the fill color, you can get this nice staggered effect so that it's easier to read. Notice when you're highlighting more than one range, the last place that you clicked on will have a white square in it, either at the start of the range or the individual cell. That's just letting you know that that was the last thing that was clicked on. The effect will still happen to that cell. So if I were to make all of these bold, you see that last cell turns bold as well. Or to undo that, it goes back to normal. Again, this is something that's not terribly difficult. It's just important to know that it's there. And by the way, this works with a lot of Microsoft programs. If you're working in, say, PowerPoint or Publisher, or even some things from Microsoft Word, you can highlight groups of areas that are not connected to each other by using that control key. So just something to be aware of. Very similar to this is grouping worksheets. If you want to make a change to a worksheet, you simply click on whichever tab you want to edit. Notice, of course, how that changes what you see on the screen as we're going through them. But if you want to change every single worksheet or a bunch of them, you can do that by holding down the control key and clicking on more than one name. And you see as I do that, it lights up all of them at the same time. The one that we're looking at still stays in the forefront, but all the other ones are highlighted with that bright light in the background as well, indicating that whatever changes I make will happen to all of them. In this situation, you do need to be careful, because if I were to just click on a cell and delete something, I would be deleting whatever is in cell A10 on all 4 worksheets, and I don't necessarily want to do that. I can't see what's on these right now, so I might delete the wrong thing. This is more something you would use if you were doing a general layout change to all of your spreadsheets. Maybe you're starting to have trouble seeing the font size that you had in there before and you want to make everything a little bit bigger. Maybe you wanted to insert a row above all of them and put a new bit of company information at the top. Whatever change you want to make will happen to all of them at once. Now, just so it's easy to see visually and so that it doesn't mess up any of our data for further exercises, I'm going to simply highlight this first column and I'm going to change the fill color to this light purple. And then I'm going to go way over here to the side on cell V2 and say, hi. So now we'll be able to look at all of the charts, and you can see first column turned purple, and way over to the side it says hi. And that happened on every single worksheet. So you can make these changes across a number of worksheets. Now you might have noticed that when I left-clicked on protection and then went to the other ones, it ungrouped the sheets. They all separated out and allowed me to make individual changes again. That is typically what will happen. But if for whatever reason they stay grouped together, this has happened in my experience fairly often when you're working from one worksheet to another, and they will stay grouped. If you want to ungroup them so you can go back to making individual changes, you can simply right-click and choose Ungroup Sheets. Notice, by the way, in the menu when you right-click, Select All Sheets is available. So if you don't have 4 tabs at the bottom, if you have 30 and you want to make changes to all of them and you don't want to have to Control-click through everything, you can do Select All Sheets, and that will grab all of them at once. That can be very helpful with a lot of worksheets, but if you just want to change 1 or 2, you need to use the Control-click technique that I just told you. Hope that was helpful. I find it to be a good time saver when I'm doing things in mass to a lot of worksheets at once. When you're changing a lot of timesheets for staff for weeks on end, if you're changing a lot of budget plans going forward, that can be an efficient way to make fast changes and not have to redo your work. Now, one last thing that I want to talk about when working with the editing and changing the formatting is how to name ranges for fast access. I don't have a great example for that in this handout, and to be honest, this isn't something I expect many of you to use that often, but it is relatively easy to do and it is occasionally helpful. So I wanted to show you what you do when you're naming a range. The point of this would be if you were, say, working with a formula and you wanted to reference a specific cell or group of cells over and over again with that formula or with other formulas throughout your worksheet, and you didn't want to type in all of the complicated cell reference, you could simply give that cell a name. So if I go over here to the Formulas tab, and I'm going to have a result right here, I want to give this cell a name. I'll put it right here at the top. And I can change that name in the name box that we see in the upper left-hand corner. Now, every cell by default has a name. That name is its column letter followed by its row number. And you see here in the name box, it says D4. If I change this to 1 squared, which is what that equation is there, and press enter, oh, you see an error that I made there because there are some very specific rules with putting in the names. You can use letters and numbers, but it has to begin with a number, and you cannot have any spaces, and the name cannot be a repeat of anything else that we've had. So I type 1 squared, and that works just fine because I began with with letters instead of the number 1. Now, what this allows me to do is anywhere else I can say this equals 1 squared, and that will put in whatever the value in that cell is right there. You might say, well, okay, that seemed like a lot of work to do something that wasn't terribly helpful. When this will be useful is when you have more complicated formulas and there are a lot of different things you need to refer to and you don't want to have to memorize all the cell references. So if you were, say, calculating a mortgage and you wanted to have the interest rate be a cell value that you were referring to, you could highlight that cell and call it interest or interest rate. Or you could highlight the principal or the extra towards balance or whatever things that you wanted to put in there into your calculations and be able to refer to over and over again, you can do that. And the nice thing is this works on any worksheet you would go to. So even if I go to a brand new worksheet and see equals 1 squared, it will still be there. And I can go back to the formulas and change this. And that changes there as well. So it can be helpful in certain situations. It's not something that I would overuse. It can become a little cluttered and confusing if you have lots and lots of names. Now, if you're wondering, hey, I was handed this worksheet, I don't know where these names came from or what they're referring to, that is something that we can work with. If you go to the Formulas tab in your ribbon and you click on the Name Manager, you will see all of the names in this worksheet. By the way, the names are, I should have said workbook, not worksheet. Workbook means the entire Excel file. These names that are created, no matter which worksheet you're on, so the worksheets are the tabs, whichever worksheet you're on, that reference will work. But if you go to another file, it will not. So if you see the names that were entered in here, there's one that I created beforehand that's no longer valid, and then the one that we just created together, that tells you what worksheet it's in, what cell it references, what the scope of it is, and you can add comments or information about it if you're so inclined by editing and putting in some more information here. Now I can see example written there. You can also, if something is no longer helpful, highlight it and choose delete. And then it is gone. So this is where you would come to check on the names that exist already within the workbook that you're working with. Okay. So those are some just next step skills that you can use when working with editing. I don't believe any of them to be any harder than things that we've done before. They're just little details that we didn't have time to cover in earlier classes or pick up on. And so I like to throw them out here because I find some of them to be helpful in different situations, and hopefully some of them will save you time as well. Now let's go on and talk some more about protection and tracking. So starting here looking at the protection worksheet that we have included with your exercise, first thing that I want to do is I'm going to get rid of this formatting here because it's a little confusing. This is what we put in when we were working with the grouping worksheets together, so I'm going to go back to no fill for that so it looks a little cleaner. Now, what I would like to show you is how we would lock down our worksheets or workbooks depending on what we're trying to do. I mentioned protection and tracking in this section here. We're not actually going to do any tracking together, but I did want to explain what that is because I've had a lot of patrons ask me about it in the past. Tracking is something you would use in a network situation, so most likely in an office place where you have more than one person that has access to a spreadsheet. If you wanted to be able to see what changes were made since the last time you opened up a spreadsheet, you can set up tracking, and that would notify you about any updates that somebody else had done to it or anything that had been changed by different usernames. That is a little bit beyond the scope of today's class, and it doesn't really apply for home use. It's just in a network situation where you have a lot of people using the same files. So that's something that can come up and is similar to what we're talking about here, but not as useful for most people. What we're going to do with protection is we are going to learn how you would lock down either the entire file or an individual worksheet. When you're locking down the entire file, that's typically something that would be done in broad strokes when you wanted to control people being able to access it. I have some experience with this. I've usually seen it when you are working with, say, financial help, whether it's somebody doing your taxes or you're refinancing a home or inquiring about credit issues. They will send information back and forth, but for security reasons, they don't want to have people be able to simply open up anything that's received in the email. So you'll have a pre-established password that will be used to unlock the workbook. Now, to make any of these changes we're going to talk about, you're going to go to the Review tab in the ribbon up here at the top, and you're going to see Protect Sheet and Protect Workbook. Protect Workbook protects the entire structure of the file itself, so that would keep people from reading what's there, deleting worksheets, things like that, and you would put in a password if you were so inclined. You might wonder, why would a password be optional? Well, we'll talk about this as it relates to the Protect Worksheet as well. But when you're putting in these protections, there are two different things you might be considering. One of them is trying to prevent access to somebody who is maliciously trying to do damage or trying to get something that they shouldn't. In that situation, you would want to definitely have a password in place to keep them from being able to do that. The other situation is preventing access from somebody that might just accidentally damage things. In that situation, you can be better off without a password because that will keep them from deleting the wrong cell by simply clicking on it and pressing the wrong button, but they would have to consciously go to the review section and turn off the protection, which a novice that you're worried about doing accidental harm probably wouldn't do. So if I were setting this up for, say, other people that work here at the library to do data entry, and I wanted to control what they were able to change, but I didn't want to have a whole bunch of passwords that we had to keep track of, I might not put in a password here. Because you want to be careful about that. To the best of my knowledge, there is no easy way to crack these passwords if you forget them. So if you put a password in for either this protection or protecting the sheet, you want to make sure you remember that password so you can get back in and make changes of your own later. So I'm going to cancel here. And I want to talk about the Protect Worksheet because I think that's a more interesting tool and more likely to be used by most of you. Now, if I click on Protect Worksheet, I see, again, the choice to put in a password if I want. And then a couple of options I want to go over. Right here at the top, it says Protect Worksheet and Contents of Locked Cells. That is what we're doing with this more often than not. So that's something that you would want to have selected if you're going to go through this process. Now, underneath there, it's asking, what do you want to allow users of the worksheet to do when it is protected? So while the protection is turned on, what can people do with this worksheet? Can they change the formatting of the cells? Can they change the columns or the rows? Do you want them to be able to insert new columns or rows or delete columns or rows? you might want them to be able to sort it. If you had a list of information and you wanted people to be able to get whatever information they wanted out of that, you could turn on allowing them to use the sorter or the auto filter if that's appropriate to it, or even pivot tables and charts if that's something that you had built in here. In this situation, we don't have any of those things, so that's not really necessary. But there are things that you might choose to allow people to do while things are still locked down in the protection. So that's entirely up to you and dependent on the information that you're working with. But for right now, we're just going to leave it so they can select locked or unlocked cells. So I click OK. I'll put in a password here just so that we can demonstrate it. I'll put in the password of 123. Not a very good password, but it'll be easy to remember for here. And I say OK. And it asks me to re-enter it for security, 123. Now, I can select whatever I want. I can highlight these things or click on them. But if I go to make changes, because the cell that you're trying to change is a protected sheet. To make a change, unprotect the sheet, you might be requested to enter a password. And that would happen too if I went to home and I tried to make it bold, italic, and underline. You see how all of these options are grayed out because they're not available right now. I cannot make any of these changes. So if I want to go back to being able to make changes, I would go back to review and choose unprotect sheet. It asks for the password 123, and I say OK. And now I can type things in again. So that's a very basic turn on, turn off the protection. You could do that if you just wanted to lock down the information for display purposes, so you could show it to people, but they didn't have the ability to make any changes. Now it gets a little bit more interesting when we talk about wanting to control certain parts of the worksheet and allow others to be changed. So if you're setting this up for somebody else to come along and fill in the data entry later on, you can choose to unlock certain sections of the worksheet and then come back to that. Now here's how we would do this. There's a formatting feature with all of the cells that we have here that we haven't really talked about before because it's not come up much. But if I highlight any of these cells, or if I use the trick that we learned earlier with selecting non-contiguous ranges, and I highlight all of them by holding down the control key, so I'm doing control click right there to get all of those, I can go to any of these little arrows, and then on the right-hand side of the window that opens up, we have protection. So I click on there. You notice that every cell is marked as locked, and that is the default for every cell in every worksheet you've ever worked on. Now, that might seem counterintuitive to you because normally you just open up Excel and you start typing and nothing seems to be locked. That's because the protection is turned off. But once the protection is turned on, all of the locked cells become uneditable. And so I'm going to uncheck locked for the ones that I want to be changeable. So now first name, last name, phone, area code, and ID number can be typed in if we like. And I'll say OK to that. Now, if I want to get extra fancy with this, I can take each of these sections here and do the merge and center to make it as if it is one cell. This is not necessary, but it can make it, for one, look a little bit nicer, and for two, it'll allow you to move through the data entry a little bit faster, and you'll see what I mean by that as we go through here. I will unmerge and center the phone number just so we can see the difference when I'm going through. So this I left as two separate cells. The rest are all merged into one individual cell. So now let's go back to the review. I'm going to go to Protect Sheet, but I'm going to make a little change this time. I'm going to make it so that you cannot select locked cells. That means you can only select the unlocked cells. So only the ones that I chose to unlock there are going to be even clickable. So when I say OK to that, I'm going to leave the password off this time just for simplicity's sake. When I say OK to that, now I'm clicking over here, but you notice that my cell block does not move around because I am not allowed to select any other cells. When I click up here, it jumps right to whichever one I selected. So now when I start typing in my information, watch what happens. I type Sean and I press the Tab key and it simply jumps to the next selectable cell. If I had not made it so that you could only select unlocked cells, when I pressed Tab, it would have gone one column over. Or if I pressed Enter, it would have jumped one row down. But if you make it so you can only select unlocked cells, it will jump to the next place that you have to enter in data. And that can make things nice and efficient. So now I type in Luster, and I press Enter, and it jumps down to there. Now you see, this is why I merged and centered those cells, because when I pressed Enter, it jumped down to the right-hand side here. It didn't line up as nicely. And if I had gone to there and I typed in a phone number, when I press Tab, it goes over to the right instead of jumping down to the next line. If you wanted to go back and edit this to correct that mistake, you would go to Unprotect Sheet, just like we did before, left click on that, and now we're able to make whatever changes we want. And I could go back to Home, highlight that. Oops. There we go. Go back to Home, highlight that, and Merge and Center. Then if I want to go back and protect it again, I can do so. So that's it for protection. Let's spend some time now talking about advanced formula tricks. So I'm going to go to the Formulas tab here at the bottom. I'm again going to get rid of the highlighting change that I made to this. And we're going to talk about a few different things that you can use with formulas. Similar to what we did with the editing, these are not necessarily going to be more complicated. They're just going to be different next step and sometimes just some little tricks. So the first one that I have here at the top, I want to talk about converting results to values. What that means is if we look at cells A1, B1, and C1, we see that this is a very simple formula that we've written saying cell C1 equals A1 plus B1 and shows us the results there. Now, if I want to take the result of that formula, which is the number 73, and convert it to the value, I can do that by using the copy and the paste special tools. So you might remember paste special if you took my Excel 2 class or if you've worked with it some in the past. We use it to create links from one worksheet to another, but we can also use it to just grab part of what's in the cell and paste it somewhere else. So I can highlight cell C1 and choose copy. And now I could paste this wherever I wanted. In this situation, I'm just going to leave it right here, and I'm going to go to paste special. And watch what happens when I click that to the formula bar here. Right now it says that this equals A1 plus B1. When I go to paste special and I choose values and say OK, it now just says 73. Instead of saying A1 plus B1, it just has the value of that here. Now your first reaction to that might be, well, this goes against everything you taught us about formulas. So the virtue of formulas is that they are dynamic and they change when the information changes and it updates as it goes. And that's absolutely true. And most of the time, this isn't what you would want to do. Most of the time, you want to keep that formula working and calculating things for you as you enter in new data. But imagine you're at the end of a fiscal year, or you are done with the report and you want to close it out and you want to get rid of all of the contributing information. You don't want to maybe archive pages and pages and pages of all of your salespeople's information. You just want the results. You just want the totals at the end. You could copy one column full of all of their results and then paste it somewhere as the value and then just archive that information. So instead of having to keep thousands of cells worth of information, you can just grab the results of it, paste it somewhere else as a value. So I found that helpful one or two times in the past, and I wanted to go back to that and show it to you because that paste special option has more to it than just creating links. So that was one thing that I wanted to toss in there. Another one that I want to show you is the autofill. Now, some of you have learned this one on your own as a quick copy and paste. If you highlight any cell and you grab that square in the bottom right-hand corner, you see that square that looks like a little black box in the bottom right of the square that fills the cell itself? When I put my mouse on that, it turns into this black plus symbol. And if I click and drag down or to the side, it copies and pastes. We sometimes use this when we write formulas. We can also use it for a lot of other things. I'm going to show you some of the autofill tricks that are available to us here. If we're doing something with our spreadsheet where we need days of the week, you can type in just one of them, drag on down, and it fills in the rest. Same thing works for months of the year. Whoops. And you don't necessarily have to start with Monday or January. You can start wherever you like and drag that on down. Of course, I'd make this column a little wider so we can see that. This also works for dates. You see as I grab this and drag it on down there, it goes to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and so on. It's particularly useful with formulas. A lot of times when I'm teaching basic formulas to people, I show them how to do something, and I say, you want to design this in a way that's reusable so you can copy and paste it from row to row to row. But that can be kind of annoying to click on a cell, go to copy, then go down to the next cell and click paste. Much easier to just grab it and drag on down here. So you see this is smart enough that this cell is C4 times C4. But when I grab this square and drag to the next one, it changes it to C5 times C5. And I can drag all the way down, and it updates them as we go. So this is really helpful with spreadsheets if you want to have formulas every single row, like say you're calculating your checkbook balance row by row. You just grab it, drag it to the next line down, use it all the time. You can even use this for just creating simple patterns. Say you wanted to have raffle ticket numbers or something like that, and you want to keep a list of them there. Now, a lot of times I've shown people this, and they said, oh, great. So I'll just type the number 1, and I grab that in the corner and drag it down. And the issue is, nope, that's just going to copy and paste the number 1. If you want to have a pattern, like say 1, 2, 3, 4, you need to get Excel started with a pattern by showing it a couple of cells. So if I do 1, 2 and highlight them both, notice you can't just grab this cell and drag on down, it'll just be all 2s. But if I highlight them both and then grab the corner and drag on down, then Excel realizes what you're trying to do. Oh, you're doing 1, 2, then 3, then 4, then so on. And it doesn't have to start with 1. It could be 1001, 1002. Or it can be 5, 10. Whatever you want to do, Excel will recognize most patterns and will figure them out and allow you to quickly drag that across. So it can be a really nice time saver there. So that's the autofill. That's something that I like to show you, and if people have used it already, you know it, great, but if you didn't, I find that to be a huge time saver. It's something that I use just about every time I use Excel, so highly recommend that. Next thing related to formulas that I want to talk about are some useful functions that we haven't talked about in previous classes. Now there are, as I mentioned in the first class in Excel, and again in Excel 2, more than 1,000 built-in functions in Excel. There's a lot of choices available to you, and so don't expect to memorize all of them or know all of them. And I would not expect you to say, yes, every single one that I showed you today is something you're going to directly use right away. I am showing you a variety of functions to try to give you a taste for a lot of different things that are out there. Because in the beginning Excel classes, I like to just talk about working with simple numbers because that's straightforward and easy to understand. But when we get more advanced, I want to show you other things that are available. So I'm going to show you some functions that deal with text. And I'm going to show you some functions that don't require any arguments. And I'm going to show you what's called nesting functions, where you put one inside of another one. And I'm going to show you what's called a logical function, where Excel looks at the data that's typed in and chooses one of two different options. That last one in particular is a really key thing that I want to make sure you get a feel for, because that is a next step in writing formulas. Learning to use the if function is a big deal when working with Excel. But let's start out with talking about text. By the way, all of these functions that I'm going to talk about are in the handout that I showed you how to get to right at the start of the class. So if you want to have that handy or listed, you can find all of them there. Now, looking here to the right, I want to abbreviate these authors' names. Figured I'm working here in a library, I'll show you something relative to that. So if you've ever used our card catalog or just browsed around, you might find that the fiction authors' books are listed by the first 3 letters of their last name and then a number system related to that. So we are going to concatenate this, and we're going to pull out 3 letters for this. Now that's a kind of a fun library example. You might wonder, why would you do this? You could do this if you wanted to say, pull the first 3 numbers for the area code out of 10-digit phone numbers that were entered in. Or if you had first initials that you wanted to pull out. We'll do that with an example in just a moment. If you wanted to pull out parts of an ID number, I'll tell you a little secret here at the library. If you have a library card number, it's 14 numbers long. The only numbers we really care about are the last 6, because those are the ones that are different from one patron to another. The first 8 are exactly the same for every single person. So when we're talking about somebody's card number, we just grab those last 6 out. So you can do that. You can just pull the last digits out of something in that way too. But we're going to do this here with authors' names because it's easy to recognize. Now, this is a function that is built into Excel. A lot of times when I'm giving examples, I say there's nothing magical about these words that are typed in. It's just an example that's here. In this case, there is something magical. Excel knows these words. And if you're wondering, how could I ever find this if you didn't demonstrate it to me? How would I know that's what's there? Well, the answer to that is you would go to the Formulas tab, and you choose to insert a function and find the appropriate function by looking through the options. So you might choose the category text and look through all the things that we have here to see what works for you. Now in this situation, I'm going to tell you some functions that are listed in the handout, so we're going to type them in ourselves. But if you prefer to work with the mouse, or if you don't know what's there, the Formulas tab insert function is the way you would want to go. Now I'm going to go ahead and type in equals left, then in parentheses. Inside the parentheses is where it asks for the arguments. If you've been in my previous classes, this is where we put in the numbers that we were adding together, or the cell references for the numbers that we were adding together. Now, the nice thing with the sum function, which is what you use to add together a group of numbers, is that it doesn't matter what order the arguments are in when you put them in, because 2 plus 4 is the same as 4 plus 2. You can toss the numbers in however you like. In this situation, though, the arguments have to be put in the correct order. And so that's asking first for the text that we're going to pull things from the left of, and then the number of characters that we're going to pull. So the text is this cell reference G4. So I'll type G4. Now, you could type in the actual text. I could type in Hemingway, like that. But that's not only cumbersome to do, it would not allow us to reuse this line by line. So I'm going to say G4 instead, comma, and then how many characters do I want? I want the first 3. And I close parentheses, and I press enter, and you get HEM. Then I use the little autofill trick we just did, drag on down, and there you go. And we've pulled the first 3 letters from all of those categories. As I said before, you can use this in a lot of different situations if you wanted to pull bits of text out from things that people have entered in when doing data entry. But if you don't find this one too helpful, that's okay. What I want you to take away from it is the 2 different arguments that we put in that meant different things, because that's going to keep coming up in these formulas as we go through. Now I'm going to jump down to another text one here. Whoops. I'm going to jump down to there, and we're going to use the Concatenate tool. This is the equivalent of the plus symbol, but for words. So if I wanted to take 2 different text fields that have been entered in and squeeze them into one cell, what I could do for that is say equals A27 ampersand B27. The ampersand is the replacement for the plus. If these were numbers we were adding together, we'd type a plus symbol. But the ampersand allows us to string 2 bits of text together. Now when I do that, I press enter, I see Sean Luster, all one word like that. That doesn't look great. It's not necessarily exactly how we would want to do it, so I'm going to go back in and refine that a little bit. But it did work. It did do what was intended. So you can see here, it took what was in the first cell, A27, and it added what was in the second cell, B27, and strung them together into one long bit of text. But I want to make it look a little nicer. So I'm going to first go in and say, you know what, I want a space between those 2. So instead of just adding together 2 things, I'm going to add together 3 things. A27 ampersand, quotation marks, space. So that is putting in just static information there. Just, I want to have a space in there. And then I put in another ampersand, and then B27. So even though one of these is not like the others, still think of this as 3 things that are being added together. 1 bit of text, which is the name, a blank space, and then a second bit of text, which is the last name. And so when I have all those 3 things, I need 2 plus symbols, 2 of the ampersands in between them. And I press enter, and I get Sean space Luster. So looking a little bit better, we're improving here, but I want to make it a little fancier. So I'm going to go back into this, and I'm going to say, you know what? I want to do last name first. So I'm going to do B27, ampersand, in quotes, comma, space, ampersand, A27. I press enter. Luster, comma, space, Sean. Great. That worked. It came out how we intended. Let's be just a little bit fancier. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the first name, and I'm going to put in another function. I'm going to say left, in parentheses, A27, comma, 1. So I'm going to have it be last name, comma, space, first initial. It's only taking the first initial because I just said 1 right there. So when I press enter, Luster, comma, space, Sean. Great. Now that I have it how I want it, I can copy and paste that on down, and it does it to every name that's been entered in there. So that's how we can use multiple text functions to adjust the data that we already have to look how we want it to look. There are a lot of other text functions there. You saw when we went to the insert function menu. Whoops, I gotta go to a blank space. We saw in the text category all kinds of options that are available, and there's a lot that you can work with. If you want more details on any of them, you can click on that. It converts the text all uppercase. Text string that represents a number to a number. So if you had a $sign, something like that, you could change it back into numbers. Lowercase, all right instead of left, all kinds of options that are available to you. Now I want to show you something that does not require any arguments at all. Remember, what we put inside the parentheses are the arguments, but there are a lot of built-in functions that pull the information from the computer, and some of the easier ones are the now and today. These are timestamps. So I could say equals now in parentheses, close parentheses. You still need the parentheses there so Excel knows that this is a function. If you don't have those parentheses, it will not work. But there doesn't have to be anything in them. And when I press enter, you can see it is June 27th at 3:58. So you know when I'm recording this. If I go here and I do equals today, open close parentheses, it gives the date. Now, you might wonder what purpose those things serve other than just as an example in this class. And right now I'm primarily concerned with them as an example. But if you're a little bit fancier with your formula writing and you learn how to use the if statements that we'll talk about a little bit later on, you could learn to create a timestamp where when somebody entered in data, it filled in another cell and it changed that so that you would know exactly when they had entered in their information. So if there was a report that was due at a certain time, or things that were supposed to report back to you by a certain day, or homework that needed to be turned in, or whatever it was, you can use this as a timestamp option to get your result there. So nice little tool that you can use, but also works as an example that not all formulas need arguments to be put into them for them to work. Now I'm going to show you this next couple of functions here. And of all the ones that I'm going to do, I think these are the least likely for you to use directly. The reason that I'm showing you these is I want to show you what are called nested functions, where you have one function inside of another one. In this case, we did a couple of functions together. We did the concatenate and we did the left function at the end of it, but we didn't really have them contained within each other. So this is a little bit of a next step for that. So what I'm doing here, again, totally arbitrary, just showing you how to do this. I wanted to have a random number between 1 and 50. Why? No reason, just showing you how this works. So the first thing that I need to do is the random number function. This is something that you would use if you were calculating odds on games, or you could be using this for statistics, lots of things that you would use that for. But in this case, I just want to use it as the inside of a function. Now, the random number function, what it does is it generates a number between 0 and 1. So it's going to be a long decimal number. So if I do that, I type enter, and it gets me 0.83228, et cetera, et cetera. Well, okay, that's fine, but I wanted something between 1 and 50. So the way you do that is you multiply it by 50. Okay, that gets me 6.26, et cetera, et cetera. If I do it again, it gives me another random number. It will keep on working every time I do it. Well, that's all well and good, but I don't want this long string of numbers. I want to have a counting number, 1, 2, 3, 27, some just solid number that we can have there. And so this is the nesting part. I am going to use the integer function, which is int. So it rounds a number to the nearest integer. And I'm putting that whole mess from before inside parentheses. So I am taking the first function that we made, the random number times 50, and I'm putting that inside of parentheses. So whatever comes out will come out as an integer between 1 and 50. So I press enter, and it tells me 6. I do it again, 44, 48, 9, and so on. No, 9 again. Unlikely. There it goes. So it bounces around and gives me random numbers. That function is not so much what's important. What is important is I wanted to show you how you can have a function, and then inside the parentheses for that, for the argument, you can have another function in it when necessary. This will be particularly important if you go on to the next step of learning how to work with if statements. Then in many cases, you want to have more complicated things happen after the if test has gone through. In my Excel formulas class, I spend about 45 minutes going over if statements and all the things that we can do with them. And this kind of nesting of functions is a really big deal for that. So I wanted to introduce it to you today, just spend a moment on it there. Okay, final function that I want to show you is over here. And this is a very basic example of the if function. This is the sum if. So what we're going to do with this is we want to have it calculate money made from clothes. So it's looking at my garage sale, and it's got all the information there. I'm going to again type equals sum, if. And then in parentheses, it wants 3 different arguments to be put in: the range, the criteria that we are testing, and the sum range. Now this is where people get confused most. The range should not be what we want to add together, it's what are we testing. So the range is all of these. So I can either highlight that and drag across, or I could type in the cell range that I wanted there. Notice, of course, you use a colon in between cell ranges to say beginning and ending and include the bookmarks. I'll then put in a comma. The criteria is I want it to say close. I will then put in a comma and give it the range of cells that I want to add together. I can drag down through there, close parentheses. And when I press enter, it's calculated 31, which is all of these numbers added together minus the 30, you see that comes to 61 down there, minus the $30 for furniture. Now this was a small little example of the SUMIF function, but I can tell you I've used this one extensively in my personal and professional life. When I used to keep my checkbook in Excel, I used to use this with calculating what I was paying month to month for all of my utilities. And so I would have it go through 7 years of my checkbook and find every check written to NICOR or every check written to ComEd. There are a lot of different things you can go through here and find that way. So I would encourage you to experiment with this one and use it to filter through your data and find the information that you want. It is also a nice step into getting comfortable with the idea of the if function, that it is doing a test and then based off of that test doing one or two different things. And so in this case, it's doing something simple, it's just adding it together. But if you go from here to the general if statement, you can then have it do two different branches depending on what the result is. And that can be much more interesting and much more productive for your functions. So that was an introduction to some other little formula tricks that we have available and some functions that we hadn't talked about before. I hope you found that helpful. Now let's go on to talking about charts and graphs. Going to the Graphs tab, we're going to look over some different kinds of charts that we can create, and we're going to talk about some more advanced options that we can throw in there. This is a bit of an addendum to what we've done in the Excel 2 class, where we learned about the basics of doing a bar chart, and I want to show you some other things that we can do to use the different features that are available and expand on what we might want to work with. Now I'm again going to get rid of the highlighting here to remove confusion. And I've put here on this tab a number of different bits of data that we might want to use. In real life, I would strongly recommend against doing anything like this. You want to have different worksheets for each individual chart that you have, because this, of course, would not allow us to keep adding items to this chart or to this one or any of them because they get in each other's way. But I wanted to keep it from being too messy for everybody when they're working with it at home, so I kept it all just in this one chart together. As we create the graphic charts that we're going to put together, I will create them in their own new tabs that they'll be a little bit separated out and easier to see. I'm going to start out by creating a line chart. You might remember if you took the Excel 2 class that I talked about how line charts are good for measuring data over time. And I'm going to use that as a good place to show you how to create a trend line. So I'm going to take the data from my checkbook here. I'm going to highlight all of the data and the labels that go with it. I'm not highlighting the word checkbook at the top because that, being alone in the column, would not balance very well with the data, and it could cause problems with creating the labels. We can always add that in later on. So I highlight this, I go to Insert, and right in the middle there I could choose Charts. Now again, if you're experienced with this, you might know the shortcut that you could jump right to with the type of chart that you have there. I'm going to click on the down arrow. It recommends the line chart, and that is what I'm going to go with. But if I want to see all charts, I could go here and choose line and then choose the subcategory that I wanted. But I'll go with the recommended one, and I'll go with the one that does not have each individual point sticking out there. But whichever way you like to go, it's perfectly fine. If you like to have it filled in, if you like to have it listed as individual points, all of those are okay. I'm going to go with that and say okay. By default, when you create a new chart, it appears right here in the middle of the screen. I'm going to move it to its own worksheet and call this line chart example. I say okay. And there we have that. Now, as is the case for all of the charts that we would work with, you can format anything that you would like here. If you want to change the appearance of this balance, you can right-click on it and choose Format Data Series. Change the color. change the thickness of the line, whatever you want it to do. If you want to change the background, you can right-click on the background and format the plot area. Put in a fill. And you can do the same for either the y-axis or the x-axis if you want to change how the labels are attached, if you want to change the value spacing between here, all kinds of things that you can play around with. What I wanted to show you today is I wanted to show you how to add a trend line to this. And so for that, I'm going to go here to Format. Oh, sorry. Back here to Design and Add Chart Element, and then slide down to Trend Line. Now, the point of a trend line, if you haven't worked with this before, is if you have a large amount of data and it's jumping up and down and all over the place, and you wanted to give an overall feel for what direction it's going in. Now, this is getting into a lot of math, whether you want to use linear or exponential, moving average. There are more options like going with a logarithmic equation to get the trend line worked out. But we keep it simple. We can just do a linear one, and that will do a straight line dividing it. Now, this is a small chart without a lot of data points, so it's not too hard to see that it's generally going up. But if you have things all over the place, that can sometimes be hard to tell. And putting in a trend line is a nice way to just see, yep, that's the direction things are going. Overall, that looks pretty good. This is something we use with line charts quite a bit, just to give us a feel for the wide range of data. So if you imagine you were showing stock holdings over time, and they, of course, go up and down quite a bit, but you wanted to see, yes, in the 10-year timeline, it has gone like so. Trend line can be great for that. So just something that I wanted to show you and I wanted you to consider. It is something that is very helpful with line charts. Something else you will often do with line charts is you will go to Select Data, and you will add in the next row. Because if you keep adding more and more items, you could add it and change this to B18. Now, right now that doesn't work because there's nothing in B18, so it just flattens it out. But if I go back to the graphs here and I type in 2202 and say 143.28, then when I go to my line chart example, not sure what happened there. I'm selecting all the data. Looking it over, everything looks good. Say OK. Ah, there we go. Yeah, it was just a problem with once it had bottomed out, we needed to go back and fix it. So that allows us to add in the next item, and that fits in. So some things you can do with line charts and any charts, but it's most commonly done with those. Let's go back to graphs. Now I want to show you adding labels to your data. And this is something that we very often do with pie charts. So I created here a budget to show you how we would handle pie charts. This is, of course, a just made up numbers sample budget that I created here. This has no relation to the library's budget at all, just make-believe things. One thing that I wanted to show you with this, because it's a mistake that I've made and I've seen other people make, if you have, for a pie chart, if you have a total amount listed, you do not want to highlight that when you are selecting the data. Because what would happen if I highlighted all of these, it would choose budget as one of the line items, that would equal 50,000, and that would be half of the pie. And then all the stuff that is supposed to be divided would be the other half of the pie. So we want to make sure we only choose the actual line items. I then go to Insert Charts, and it actually recommends a bunch of different options here. The one that I would like is the pie chart, but if you go to All Charts, Pie Chart, you can see a number of different options. I find a lot of the more complicated pie charts to be a little distracting, so I usually stick with the basic one. Say OK to that. And I am again going to move that chart to its own worksheet. We'll call that pie chart example. Now, a couple of things that I might want to do here. I can change the chart title and call that budget. Then I'm going to add chart elements and choose data labels. Right now there are none. There are no data labels. In most charts, I don't think you want to have data labels. If you're looking at a line chart, if you have data labels in there, it looks very cluttered very quickly. If you're looking at a bar chart, the whole point of it is supposed to be that it's visually easier to handle than just looking at all the data. But pie charts, because they can be so incremental and they can be so hard to tell exactly what section or percentage that is, I like to add data labels to whenever possible. So when you're doing this, if you're going from none to something else, you choose where do you want them to go. Do you want it to be in the center of the pie pieces? Do you want it to be on the inside but the end of them? The outside but the end of them? Whatever the best fit is? Or do you want to have the data call out, so the little bubbles? I personally like the data call out, especially if you have a very detailed pie chart that has a lot of thin slices. They very often won't fit inside of those slices. If you have an older version of Excel, you might not have the data call out as an option, and then outside end can work pretty well for that too. And when you have the outside end, if you click on any of the individual pieces and you drag it a little bit, it will create a line to the section of the pie that it works with there. You might have noticed that when I clicked on this first, it selected all of them at once. You don't want to change all of them at once by dragging them and moving around. So if you click on it a second time, it then changes it to the individual one and allows you to, click and drag. You see when you have that compass with the 4 black arrows and the hollow center on it, that's when you can click and drag it around. And I can now click and drag all of these and create the tails that go to it. So feel free to play around with that. There are other data label options that you could go into. Instead of having the value, you could change it to a percentage. So it tells you that that's 20% instead of the total value. All kinds of things you can experiment with. Let's go back to the graphs table here. And then finally, I want to show you something similar to what I did in Excel too, where I was doing a bar chart to compare computer companies. Again, these are made up numbers unrelated to any reality, and most of these companies don't exist anymore. So don't worry too much about that. But what I wanted to show you here is what do you do when you have one value that is not like the others. So I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to again go to Insert, Charts. And you see here that it recommends a bar chart, just like we were doing here. But there's a little bit of a problem. When I say OK to this, and again, I'm going to move this chart to its own worksheet. You see one of these bars is significantly larger than the others. Because if I go back to look at the data here, see we have a lot of things rated on a 1 to 10 scale, and then we have price examples, and that of course is much higher than the number 10. So what you want is you want to pull the prices out and have them on a secondary axis. That's what we're going to have to do here. So to do that, I right-click on this data series and I choose Format Data Series. Right now, it's set Plot Series on primary axis. I change that to secondary axis. Now you see we have the other 3 categories are listed on a scale of 0 to 10. And this one is listed on the price scale over there. Now, once we've done that, we might want to make some other changes so that it's a little bit easier to tell the difference between how these things fit in. So I'm going to go to the fill option here and say no fill. So we can still see the chart here, and we can have it separate from this. Or you could put in a color and you can adjust the transparency. A lot of things you can play around with this. I frequently will use the secondary axis with line charts as well. If you have 2 things that are group together and make sense together, but are being graded on a different scale, you can see the lines going up and down in the same way, even if they are on different scales there, and they don't overlap with each other nearly as much as these bar charts do. But that allows you to see related data that has a different measuring aspect to it. So those are some extra tools that we can use with the charts that come up pretty often. Remember, just about everything with your charts is formatable. So I can change this chart title here at the top. I could change the background. Whatever I wanted to do. Feel free to play around with and adjust these however you like. Now, the last thing that I want to show you today is I want to go over some of the options that we have available in Excel. So to do that, I would go to File and Options. This is where we would see some of the things that you would control on the Excel on your own computer. So if you wanted to go through this and change how things were organized, for example, when you save, where does it save to automatically? Do you have it go to an auto recover? Do you have it saving to your documents folder? Most of the time that's what we would like, but if you're in a workplace situation, you might have your own user profile that you want to put this to. You might want to save it to your desktop if that's convenient for you, whatever makes sense for you there. How often do you want to have it auto backup? Every 10 minutes? Do you want it to keep things when you close without saving, or do you not want to be bothered by that? Look at the formulas options here. You can have it automatically calculate the formulas. Most of us want that. Sometimes, though, if you're testing formulas out, you might want to change it to manual. Some things in the General tab. When you create a new file, how many worksheets do you want to start with? By default, newer versions of Excel start with 1. Older versions started with 3. A lot of people, when I was first teaching Excel, found it annoying that it always came up with 3 worksheets for them when they just wanted 1, so you could change that down to 1 if you wanted. I had somebody recently ask me if there was a quicker way than creating all the different worksheets if they had to do something where they had a tab for each week. And I said, yes, you can come here and you could change this to 52 and then create a new file, and that would have 52 worksheets in it. I'm not going to leave it that way for mine because I don't want to have 52 worksheets with most of my things, but you can change that if it's appropriate, or you can change it to 12 for the number of months of the year, whatever you typically use or you want to use right at this time. Also, you can adjust the default font size, little things like that. If you have security issues, you can go to the Trust Center. This is where you would turn on settings for working with files that are sent to you via email or downloaded off the web. If that's not something that you do very often, you probably want to leave the trust settings as they are. But if you work with a lot of networked files, you might want to come in here and change the settings so you don't get a warning every single time you try to open things up. So if you work with a lot of things that are sent to you over email or OneDrive or however you handle that, this might be something that you need to come here and help yourself out with. This is also where you would customize a quick access toolbar. That's the little buttons that we see here up at the top. You can change those. You can add, instead of just having save, undo, and redo, if you had something else that you like to be able to do all the time, you could add it to that. I could say, we learned about freeze panes today. Maybe I really want to have that available all the time. I do that and I say, okay. And now the freeze panes button is up there at the top. So there's a lot of things you can toy with. I'd encourage you to look around in the options. Be cautious about this. You don't want to change things if you don't know what it's referring to. But if you want to experiment a little bit, just keep track of what you're changing so you can always come back and change it back. This will only affect your computer. So if you work with computers in different situations, if you come into our lab, for example, don't be surprised if it does not have those same changes on there. So that's it for Excel 3. I hope all of you found this helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to add something in the comments or contact me directly here at the library. My name is Sean. I'm the head of the Computer Services Department. Let us know about any classes you'd like to see, both in person and online. We're trying to do our best to work with everybody on these and expand whatever services we can during these difficult times. Thank you for all your help and your time. Have a great day.